I'm Susie Spickle, Community Programs Director here at the Harris Center and one of the naturalists. And I'm joined by my wonderful colleague, Brett Thielen, who many of you might know from her amazing Salamander Brigade. Brett, do you want to just give us a little exciting news about the Salamander Brigade from this year?
Well, hi all. I'm Brett. I'm here mostly just to kind of help with the chat and everything tonight, but we're just fresh off one of our last amphibian migration nights of the year last night, and um, this year for their Salamander Brigade project, we crossed our 100,000th amphibian in the project's history, moved 100,000 amphibians to safety on spring nights. So we're pretty excited about that.
So exciting. And Brett, that's a great segue. For those of you that are familiar with the Harris Center, yay! And for those of you who are signing in and maybe are signing in from far away and don't know much about the Harris Center, I'll just give you a little bit of a background. The Harris Center is in Hancock, New Hampshire, in the southwest corner of New Hampshire, and we've been around for over 50 years. Our work has been helping people of all ages and from all walks of life connect to the natural world in this beautiful place we call our home. We work on teaching people about the natural world, protecting lands, which we've now have over 27,000 acres of protected lands around the Harris Center. And we work on projects like the Salamander Brigade, conservation research and science. So welcome everybody. Um, Before I go over what we're going to be talking about tonight, I'll tell you about a couple of cool things that are coming up. We have an upcoming event on May 20th. It's a lunch and learn from 12 to 1 p.m. via Zoom. You can find out about the life and times of New Hampshire's fisher. I'll be talking about fisher, and you'll be interested to know there's a little bit of rodenticide talk included in my New Hampshire fisher presentation. And if you're not able to come to that, you might want to come to our June 23rd Zoom presentation from 5:30 to 6:30, where we'll be learning about a citizen science, a community science project for the monarch larva project. It's an introduction to this project that Brett and I have participated in for what, like 5 years now, Brett? Counting monarch caterpillar eggs and caterpillars. And it's a great way to participate in science and add to the data. All right. Last little bit of news for me is just a few rules or tips on our Zoom. Tonight's Zoom, everybody will be muted. And if you have a question or a comment, you can put it in the chat. And we encourage you to put it in the chat. We'll be able to ask our presenter questions at the end that I'll curate from the chat. So put those questions in the chat. The other thing that I want to let you know about is this program is being recorded and will be available to those people who signed up. If you don't want to be seen on the recording, you can close down your video. Also, if you're interested in closed caption, you can find that under the More button at the bottom of your or your toolbar screen for Zoom. Some people have it at the bottom, some people have it at the top, and you can open up the closed captioning. Brett, did I forget anything? She's giving me the thumbs up, ready to roll. All right, this is so exciting because tonight we have the pleasure and honor of having Laura Kiesel. She's a wonderful writer and environmental advocate. Her work has been published in many different places. You might have read them in magazines and newspapers like The Atlantic, Politico, The Guardian, The Washington Post, and many other places. And she is currently working on a book about the impacts of rodenticide on the environment and public health. We're so excited to have you here, Laura, and for you to be sharing with us your knowledge about this really important topic.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited. So do we want to start? Yes, great. So Susie's going to be sharing my screen since I can't do screen share right now. So my name is Laura Kiesel. As she stated, that I am a longtime environmental writer. I also have an academic background in wildlife biology and natural resources sciences. And I've been researching and reporting on rodenticides for a little over a decade now, about 11 years. So next slide, please. Great. So when we talk about rat poisons, there are a few different kinds, but the main kind that we'll be talking about tonight are called second generation anticoagulant rodenticides, which is a mouthful. So I'll mostly be referring to them by their acronym, which is SCARs. There are four main ones that are registered in the US, and I feel like they're purposefully made to be these long technical titles, but it's Brotificum. And so I've been actually still struggle with the pronunciations of this: bromadiolone, difenicum, and difethialone. There are also first generation anticoagulant rodenticides, which are warfarin, chlorofascinone, and difascinone. These first generations were made, I think, around in the 30s and 40s. But within a decade or so of their use, rodents started to develop a pretty robust resistance to them. So then in the 70s, they started making these second generation anticoagulants, but they didn't really become more mainstream use till the 80s and 90s. And then there are a couple of other rat poisons that are in mainstream use, but not as popular as the anticoagulants. And that's bromethalin, which is a neurotoxin, and cholecalciferol, which is otherwise known as kind of a megadose of vitamin D. Next slide, please. So from the 80s through the early 2000s, thousands of children were winding up getting poisoned by rodenticides, primarily, again, the SCARs poisons. Anywhere between 10 to 50,000 children were being poisoned annually by these. At the time, they were mostly sold over the counter. A lot of people were using them in their home when they were like kind of cash strapped, and unfortunately kids, they looked like candy. They were in these loose pellets. So next slide. So in 2004, the Natural Resources Defense Council and We Act for Environmental Justice, which is an environmental justice organization based out of Harlem in New York City, sued the EPA for allowing these poisons in such widespread use and in loose pellets. And after like a decade of back and forths, the EPA actually decided a few years later that they were going to pull the over-the-counter versions of these SCARs. The manufacturer of Decon balked and like countersued the EPA, and it was tied up for almost a decade in the courts. But finally, in 2015, the manufacturers of Decon agreed to stop allowing SCARs to be their main ingredient of those sold over the counter. So starting about a decade ago, SCARs are mostly not available in most over-the-counter stores, consumer hardware stores, things like that, because of this ruling. However, the EPA guidelines still allow licensed pest control professionals to use these in so-called tamper-resistant bait stations. And starting around a decade ago, at least here in Boston metro area, these bait stations around that same time started to really proliferate to the point where sometimes you'd see them on every block around certain like town centers, areas of high human density. So next slide, please.
Sorry, Laura, I'm having trouble advancing. There we go.
Great. So, but this is a big problem. So even though not selling SCARs has helped reduce, but not eliminate, but reduce child poisonings, it actually has accelerated wildlife poisonings because this proliferation of these bait stations doesn't address that part. So as this like graphic that I worked on kind of illustrates, the rodent is the poison source for most wildlife. So like a pest company puts down these bait stations, the rodent goes inside, and then it goes into the outdoor environment. That's it working as it was designed. And it has a lag time on purpose. So the poison does not kill the rodent right away. So it can last days or weeks before it will actually kill the rodent. And in that time, the rodent can wind up eating this poison dozens or hundreds of times more. So by the time it gets eaten by a predator, it has many, many times the fatal dose. Plus, these predators like owls and foxes and fishers, they don't just eat one or two mice. They eat dozens of these rodents in a week or a month. So they wind up getting a lot of bioaccumulation, and then they also wind up dying from these poisons. Next slide, please. So I wrote my first article about this back in 2018. I had already been advocating and researching it for a few years. The reason I started getting involved is one day in 2015, I walked outside of my apartment building, and I lived at the time at affordable housing, and the pest control company was putting 20 bait stations around our complex, and we didn't even have a rodent problem. They were being put down as a preventative because our neighborhood was being hit with a lot of construction was about to be underway in the coming months. And so my alarm bells kind of just went off in my head of why were they putting down like 24 bait stations in this little complex area. And that's what really started to pique my interest. And I kind of fell down a rabbit hole of research. Next slide, please. And only a couple years after I wrote that first article about it, EPA came up with their 2020 report on these rodenticides. They do one every like 5 to 10 years, and they concluded in no uncertain terms that these anticoagulants that have high risks, that is well established, and it includes mortality from both direct consumption, so if they get into the bait, or in cases of birds of prey, secondary, so they're eating the rodents, as well as other growth and reproductive impacts. Next slide, please. And only a year or less after that report came out, here in my town of Arlington in the Boston metro area, we got our first bald eagle nest, which was very exciting because it was our first bald eagle nest in almost a century since, poaching and DDT extirpated the eagles out of our state and most of the region. And so that was MK the eagle, and she was really well beloved in our area because she was very used to humans. You could get pretty close to her and take pictures, and she wasn't phased. Next slide, please. And so she had, they built their nest. They had these two fledglings, C25 and C26. That's C25, as you can see in the left-hand corner, sort of looks like a Jim Henson creature. And that other picture I took in the bottom right-hand corner is only a couple weeks before she wound up dying. I actually watched her on this date. Her mother brought a large rat to them. That they were nesting in a cemetery surrounded by businesses with bait boxes. And I don't know if you can even see in the picture, but you might be able to see there are these like little green flecks on her bottom wingtips. And when I could actually see the green splatter. So when a rodent has had a recent consumption of bait, because it's like a phosphorescent green or blue, sometimes it will actually kind of splatter the animals that are eating it like paint. So I was very worried about C25. Next slide, please. And so C25, only a couple weeks after I took that photo, she did succumb to secondary poisoning due to these rodenticides. She was the second eagle in only a few months' time in the Boston metro area to be confirmed to die, where the state actually did a necropsy. Next slide, please. That's the first eagle that died, confirmed just a few months before C25. You can see her in the left-hand side. A friend of mine took that photo, and then only a couple weeks later, that's someone removing her dead body. She was actually incubating eggs, so she was on top of her unhatched eggs, and they found that she was gravid, carrying additional eggs inside of her. And in fact, they think the laying eggs might have led to her hemorrhage because she had these ARs in her system. Next slide, please. So then I wrote my second article back in 2021 in response to these two eagle deaths. And this was a kind of deeper delve into the EPA's complicity, pest control industry, and the other factors that were kind of contributing to this problem. Next slide, please. And also around that time, about 5 months, 6 months after C25, we had a family of great horned owls nesting in our park. Also, we hadn't had something like that in, I don't know, 20 years. But we found only a few weeks after that top left-hand photo was taken, the mother and one of the fledgling was found dead. And then a couple of days later, the other fledgling was found and had all the signs of anticoagulant poisoning, so bleeding post-mortem out of like their mouths and ears. And then they left behind the male. So great horned owls usually mate for life. And so for the next, like, I don't know, 5 months or so, he was on his own. And it was very sad because great horned owl like I said, they pair bond, but also they have like a duet at night, like where they sing back and forth to each other. And so I would just hear his side of the duet every night when I'd go check on him. And then in November, he finally found another mate, and everybody in town was very happy. But then within 2 weeks, she was found on the ground spitting up blood. That's her in the right hand corner of this. And she died en route to the rehab facility. This time we did do a crowdfunding where we paid for her necropsy, because the first time around, even though there were all these signs where it was clearly anticoagulant poisoning, people were like, well, you don't know for sure, you didn't get it tested. But the second mate we did get tested and confirmed that the eschars were complicit in her death. Next slide, please. And, you know, this kind of undermines rodent control. A typical great horned owl within 1 year can consume 4,000 mice and about 1,500 rats. So when we wound up losing like 3 owls, those are thousands and thousands of rats and mice that are now going to live on and procreate. And unlike with the rodenticides, these rodents can't develop resistance or bait shyness. So we're actually making our rodent problems worse by killing off their predators. Next slide, please. So we kind of had enough when we lost our eagle, we were already very upset in town. And so we decided we really needed to push our town to do something more aggressive. And I had been advocating for 7 or 8 years behind the scenes with my town to do something, but I really think the eagle finally underscored the issue to them. But I started Save Arlington Wildlife. I realized, just as Laura Kiesel or me and a couple of other folks, it was not going to get the attention of our electeds the way having a more formalized group with a name and a website would. So we started Save Arlington Wildlife in early 2022 to raise awareness on rodenticides. And we started collaborating with other people in other towns to do something similar after a while. But next slide, please. But I want to talk about why we chose that name to Save Arlington Wildlife. And now there's like many other Save Wildlife groups in the state, because we wanted to first make people understand that wildlife are everywhere. You know, so every town has wildlife. It doesn't have to be a remote or rural area. Like, we have a rich array of our wildlife in our own backyards. But also to really have a feeling of familiarity and like allegiance. Like, these are our animals, like our neighbors that are dying right in our town from these poisons that we're trying to protect, like our wildlife. And it also just is like, you know, you think globally, but you want to act locally in the ways that we can make change. Next slide, please. So in 2022, right around the time our owls died and after C25 died, Arlington became the first community in Massachusetts to formally codify a ban on our public municipal properties and buildings on all eschars. We also did something where we filed a home rule petition with the State House. And not all states have this option, but here in Massachusetts, so most states in the country cannot ban pesticide use on private property because of state preemption laws. And that's because of the pest control and pesticide lobby. Back in the 90s, they lobbied all the states to take away those rights from towns and cities. And so unfortunately, a lot of times towns and cities don't have a lot of agency, but at least in Massachusetts, we do have the ability to file a home rule petition at the State House saying we want a waiver, we want special permission to be able to ban these on private properties in our borders as well. So we filed that. And then in 2023, the city of Newton followed suit. And at this point, there are now over 100 Save Wildlife groups in Massachusetts. About half of them, I think, have adopted some kind of public lands ban on eschars or anticoagulants, both FGARs and eschars. And about a quarter of them have either filed a home rule petition. I think about a dozen right now have active ones at the State House, and about a dozen more have passed or are primed to pass right now in this spring's town meeting season. Next slide, please. And again, so this was something that the pesticide and pest control lobby fought for. They want either the EPA or the states to have all the agency because it's easier to lobby state or federal elected officials than towns or cities, which are sometimes more beholden to their constituents and have a harder time when there's a lot of activism in their town saying no. Next slide, please. And so this is a map. It's a little dated now. So it says 43 states have preemption laws, but it's actually now 46. And again, only a few states, Massachusetts, New York, maybe Connecticut, have the ability to do home rule petitions or waivers. But I'll talk about other ways that you can do if you can't do a home rule. Next slide, please. So then now C25's mother, back in February 2023, then she became sick with this anticoagulant poisoning. So this was the matriarch of that same nest. Next slide, please. And when she died, I held a vigil the day after her death was announced. And I thought maybe a couple of dozen people would show up, but over 300 people showed up, and this was with less than 24 hours notice. They marched from one of the town greens to the town hall with signs saying that they wanted this banned. And I really think this was a turning point in the state. Up until this point, I just think a lot of the larger nonprofits, the state representatives, they still weren't willing to entertain the idea of prohibiting these poisons. But when they saw this showcase of hundreds of people coming out in the winter, standing in like snowy, cold weather, like a lot of news came, it really started to change the conversation. Next slide, please. And I mean, our eagles here are not at all an isolated, isolated anecdote. There was a study that came out a few years back that found 82% of bald and golden eagles have exposure rates to these anticoagulants. That's a pretty high number. And even though not all of them definitively died from that exposure in and of itself can compromise their fitness and make them more susceptible to mortality from other things. Next slide, please. And just to remind us, like, again, the tragic irony with bald eagles, we completely extirpated them by the 1960s in the entire like New England northeastern region. We banned DDT in 1972, and it took it took about 35 years to recover the eagles from that point to where they could be taken off the federal endangered species list. And it took like lots of money. I mean, literally, federal agents had to hand raise like chicks with puppets, like by the thousands, to help recover this animal. And even though recovery on the federal level was 2007, it's been slower in a lot of the New England states. They're actually still on the Massachusetts state endangered species list, and they were still threatened until only like not even a year before we lost several eagles from these poisons. And now there's still a species of special concern here in state. And I think several other northeastern states, they're still on their state endangered species list. Next slide, please. And this is not just relegated to eagles. Here in Massachusetts, Tufts Wildlife Clinic, I think basically leads the nation in research on the impacts of these poisons on birds of prey. They found back in like 2000, I think it was 12, they looked over a 6-year period and found an 82% exposure rate among, a swath of different birds of prey, including great horned owls, barred owls, red-tailed hawks. But then they repeated it only like 5 years later. I think it was like in 2017, and that rate had jumped. Oh, sorry, it was an 86% exposure rate, and it jumped within only like 6 years from an 86% exposure rate to 96% of these birds of prey are now exposed. And then only a year or two after that, they did a study just on red-tailed hawks in Massachusetts, and all 100% of the, I think it was 43 or 44 hawks had exposure rates to these poisons. Next slide, please. And we started here in Arlington. Well, actually, Cape Ann Wildlife deserves a lot of credit. They're a raptor rehabilitation organization here in Massachusetts, on Cape Ann area of the state. So they started testing a lot of the animals that were dying in their care, dying en route to their care, that were exhibiting signs of anticoagulant exposure. And they were just finding that all of them were exposed, basically, and most of them were being exposed in high amounts and had all the signs of toxicosis, meaning they had a lot of internal bleeding. And, there was the owl in that top right-hand corner. That's the rehabber Erin. She's opening the mouth to show that the animal died aspirating on her blood, which is also how MK the eagle died. I actually had gotten a call Even though I'm not a rescue organization or a rehabber, a lot of times Save Arlington Wildlife just gets calls about injured wildlife. And I feel really bad that a call came in and I didn't get it till that evening about an owl that was just like face down in at one of the playground sandboxes in my town. And I went at 8 o'clock at night. The call had come at 11 a.m. And that owl was still alive, but like just blood coming out of all of its orifices. We rushed it to the rehabber and it basically died as it arrived. So I paid for the necropsy and it had like just immense rates of poisoning in its system. But these are just some of the animals we've picked up in the past couple of years, just in our town in Arlington. Next slide, please. And just to, also put this, we don't handle here in Arlington, we don't really get snowy owls, but I did want to mention that snowy owls are another frequent victim often of these. That owl in the left-hand corner, that's Seabrook the snowy owl. Some people might have heard of him. He was from that kind of, I think it's called Seabrook Beach in New Hampshire. He wound up several times at a rehabber's with anticoagulant poisoning. That's a picture of him right before he was taken, I think, the second time, and you can see he looks in rough shape, and he didn't make it. And snowy owls I don't think they're on any state endangered species list, but I don't really know why, because the IUCN or Conservation International, they are red listed as vulnerable, which is the category right before endangered. And there's an organization called Project Snowstorm, and they have looked at anticoagulant exposure rates among snowy owls all around the continent, and they have found that that kind of coastal area between New Hampshire and Massachusetts, like Plum Island, Hampton Beach, has some of the highest rates of exposure and lethal exposure rates of the snowy owls they've looked at. Next slide, please. But it's not just our raptors. It's other animals too. Canids like foxes and coyotes are very vulnerable. Our mesocarnivores, which are like skunks, raccoons, and possums, have very high rates of poisonings in studies. Crows, fishers, and even in California, they're felling, like in some cases, mountain lions, which I know is one of the reasons why I think California has led on this issue, because they're even losing some of their cougar population either directly or indirectly to these poisons. Here in Arlington, we even lost a great blue heron to these poisons. So even like animals that you don't think of as typical are getting affected. Next slide, please. So in addition to some of the local work we've done, I'm part of a coalition with a handful of other conservation advocates, including Cape Ann Wildlife, that raptor rehabilitation group, where we filed a legal petition here in Massachusetts. Harvard Animal Law and Policy Clinic represents us pro bono, where we have asked our pesticide board to suspend the use of these anticoagulants, where, Cape Ann Wildlife's many necropsies and liver panel testing has been submitted. And I do want to mention, this is what California did too. California is the only state that has a moratorium on these poisons right now. I don't think people sometimes know behind the scenes what had to be done. Even though they did get a law passed in the legislature, what really leveraged that was they similarly wound up filing a lawsuit. In that case, we have a legal petition, which is a little different, but they filed a lawsuit with the help of Stanford Law Clinic about the use of poisons in that state. So we're kind of trying a multi-pronged approach with the legal petition, with the local initiatives, to try to really pressure Massachusetts to do something. Next slide, please. And so here at Save Arlington Wildlife, I also started kind of a spin-off organization called Save Massachusetts Wildlife, or Save Mass Wildlife. And we also kind of extended what Cape Ann Wildlife did, and we started testing animals that were found in and around Arlington, so either right in town or a handful of our neighboring communities. And basically, again, every animal that we were getting reports of that had died, mostly birds of prey, had died of these poisons. So and this is dated, so this is just from July 21st. On July 2021 to January 2025, we had 21 wildlife mortalities just in Arlington. And these are just the ones we got before someone threw the animal away, or it disappeared, probably got scavenged. 17 of those 21 were confirmed by necropsies and liver panel testing. All but one tested for the lethal range of exposure, which starts at 100 parts per billion. All but two All of them had 2 or more eschars in their system, but most had 3 or more compounds. And of those who tested in lethal range, all but one tested for levels that were at least 300 parts per billion, so at least triple time the lethal beginning of the lethal threshold. The highest, which was a red-tailed hawk, had well over 1,000 parts per billion of these poisons in its system. Next slide, please. And yes, they do affect scavengers as well as predators. And so this is just a quick, I tried to do some graphing to just show how it was impacted across species and percentage of rates and like what kinds of eschars versus FGARs were affected, just to kind of give people a visual. Next slide, please. So there's more, as you can see, birds of prey really seem to bear the brunt of these poisoning, but again, carnivores, fur bearers, and small mammals also are getting hit too. Next slide, please. So for instance, we had this coyote puppy that wound up with the vet we partner with. As you can see, this coyote pup's in pretty rough shape. So these poisons actually have been correlated to the development of fatal or very severe mange in fur-bearing mammals because it compromises their immune system. So this, as you can see, this coyote puppy had really severe mange, but also when it died, and it did die, it had, when they opened it up, he just was bleeding huge amounts of internal bleeding in his abdominal cavity and other parts of his body. And he had the highest rate of, we ultimately tested 40 animals with my organization, and this coyote puppy had the highest rate at, I think it was over almost 1,400 parts per billion of eschars. And again, the lethal threshold starts usually for birds of prey 100, so maybe mammals more like 200-300 parts. So again, almost 10 times that, or like many times that rate. Next slide, please. Again, that's just talking a little bit about the correlation between rodenticides and mange. This is actually why they started banning not just the eschars, but the FGAR difascinone, because that was also linked to mange, and it was actually compromising a population of bobcats in California to the point where it was plummeting them. Like over 75% of the population had declined in relation to this mange outbreak that was correlated to the anticoagulants. Next slide, please. Here in Arlington, another case that stood out is we had a gray fox. And what was notable is the primary poisoning agent in this case was not a eschar, but a FGAR, chlorofascinone, so a first generation. Gray foxes are here in Massachusetts a species of greatest conservation need. They're kind of rare. And in general, gray foxes are on the decline throughout New England. So this was our only denning family of gray foxes in our town. I don't even know when the last time we had one. So it was very sad that within months of them setting up their den, one died from these anticoagulants. Next slide, please. But again, we're getting atypical species. So we also had our first snapping turtle fatality correlated to these poisons. It had widespread internal bleeding in its abdomen, and it had almost 400 parts per billion. Some people are like, well, how can snapping turtles get this? Snapping turtles will eat carrion, so they are ecosystem engineers. They eat dead matter. So if a rat dies and falls into the water, or rats do swim, if it dies of anticoagulant, sinks to the bottom, a snapping turtle is going to eat whatever it finds at the bottom. Or even if a bird of prey dies and falls to the bottom of a river or pond, it's going to get eaten by the carrion eaters in that ecosystem. So it's really not that surprising when you think about it. Next slide, please. New England Wildlife Center, it's another wildlife rehabilitation center we collaborate with a lot. They've seen a huge spike in their cases. They get between 100 and 200 cases of AR poisoned wildlife every year. And again, this is just one center in one part of the state. But what stands out to them is not just the spike in cases, but the fact that the animals, there's a higher lethality rate. And those animals that do recover are taking much longer and a lot more resources. So this owl in this photo, so his parents both died from the eschars. One of his siblings died of eschars. As you can see, he's bleeding out of all like his mouth and his ears. They tried everything. They tried a blood transfusion. He still died. His sibling, not photographed here, was the only survivor, and it took 9 months of daily vitamin K infusions till her blood would clot on its own again. So again, anticoagulants work by depleting your body of vitamin K, and you need vitamin K to clot. So she had to be on high amounts of vitamin K every day for 9 months till her blood could clot. They had never had an animal that long, but now they're saying multi-month treatments are becoming the norm. It used to take, 4 to 6 weeks. Now it takes 4 to 6 months for a lot of these animals that can recover to recover. Of course, this is also draining these wildlife hospitals of resources because it's an enormous amount to care for these animals that long. Next slide, please. And so after a certain number of communities filed home rule petitions, passed public lands bans, we finally got a real prohibition right now that's been filed at the State House. Up till then, it was more of a tracking bill. But again, this is how local communities can really help push the state to do more. So, electeds weren't even willing to entertain the idea of a real ban. But once they saw all these communities doing it and the legal petition, they were like, okay, we're going to file a ban. And it's still in the State House, but it's got a lot of momentum. So we do think it will pass, if not this legislative session, maybe the next one. Next slide, please. And it's not just wildlife. Pets are also affected. MSPCA here in Massachusetts sees between 40 and 60 cases a year of mostly dogs, but sometimes cats as well. And the cost of veterinary care can take, if the animal recovers, $5,000 or more. That is Lucy. She's a terrier cross pictured there. And it took, what did take over $5,000, and she had to be on vitamin K for over a month to recover. And her mom still doesn't know where she even picked that up, the poisons. She probably just found it off the street. Next slide, please. And this is another case of someone I interviewed for my book. The pest control, it was Terminex. They came into her apartment. Her apartment wasn't even slated for treatment. She didn't even know she had rat poison in her apartment. She came home and her dog wasn't feeling well. The next morning, her dog woke up and the dog was bleeding out of every orifice and wound up passing away. And again, Terminex wasn't even supposed to be in that apartment. So it was just really tragic. And so these are the kind of things that are also happen sometimes with our pets. And unfortunately for renters, and I feel this sometimes very vulnerably as a renter too, you don't always have power of what your landlord is using on the property. You're supposed to have a little more power of what they use inside your property, but in this case, it was an error, but it cost her dog its life. Next slide, please. And so we've done a number of billboards, and we've done ones on wildlife too, but we also try to stress to people understand that it's pet poison as well. And those two animals are two real animals of people I've interviewed whose pets died of these poisons. Lenny, the greyhound, in the left-hand side, his guardians actually rented an Airbnb, and he had eaten grass by the bait station, and it had been a lot of rainstorms recently, so the bait had actually come out of the bait station and drenched the grass that he had chewed, and he wound up dying while they were at that Airbnb from that. And it was considered a dog-friendly Airbnb designation, but there's nothing about whether or not to use poisons. Next slide, please. So FGARs are also deadly to pets as well. Basically, all rat poisons are very deadly to pets. There's no rat poison that isn't deadly to pets. If a pest control or someone tells you that, that's just not the truth. FGARs and bromethalin have been increasing, creeping into more poisoning rates for cats and dogs, but still SGARs are the number one usually culprit of dog, especially dog poisonings. Child exposure rates also, even though SGARs, them getting rid of them off the over-the-counter sales did help reduce child poisonings, several thousand children are confirmed to still be dying, not dying, but exposed or sickened from SGARs every year. And FGARs and bromethalin's a neurotoxin, are also increasing in child exposure rates, actually at a rate that seems to correspond with the reduction in SGARs exposures. So as SGARs exposures in children are going down, FGARs and bromethalin, both of which are still available over the counter, are going up steadily. And primarily, disproportionately, a lot of the children are usually low income, often low income children of color, which makes this an environmental justice issue. Next slide, please. And it's not just children that are affected. There was a couple of outbreaks, one in 2018 and one in 2021, and they don't know how it happened, but there was this synthetic marijuana across many states around the US somehow had gotten laced with the Escar brodifacoum, which is the deadliest anticoagulant, and hundreds of people wound up in hospitals across the country. Dozens of people died. I also, I sometimes hear pest companies will say, well, these are just tiny little rates. They can barely kill a mouse. Again, this was just synthetic marijuana that was cut with a little bit of brodifacoum, and it managed to make people go to the hospital. Many died. So think of what it's doing to animals if it can fell a human adult. In this case, they think maybe it was a nefarious thing. They don't know why this marijuana was cut with it, but it was very sad because, some people, they would get checked out of the hospital and they wouldn't take their vitamin K, because again, you have to take vitamin K every day, sometimes for months after this exposure. And if they just, got a little bit relaxed about not taking their vitamin K, they'd wind up maybe nicking themselves in the shower or like brushing their teeth and getting bloody gums, and it would just set off the hemorrhaging again. And some people who even survived the first wave wound up dying when they wound up getting back into the hospital if they didn't take the vitamin K. And vitamin K is actually very expensive for humans. That's okay. Next slide. So, pest control companies, I do want to say there's not really a lot of laws that protect what they have to. They can basically lie to you legally. There's no law under FIFRA, which is the federal law about pesticides distribution, that requires them to tell you like that these can hurt people or pets or wildlife. They did a survey back in 2017 of 35 pest control professionals, and they found that basically universally, all of them didn't seem to really have a good understanding of how Escars worked, about how potent it was, about how secondary impacts worked. What was also notable is all of them called themselves IPM professionals. All of them said that they were IPM or certified IPM. So IPM can kind of be a greenwash term, because even though all of the respondents said they were IPM professionals, almost all of them but a couple said that they used Escars as their first and mainline default option for rodent control. They would put down the Escars. So next slide, please. And, if you speak to some of the really seasoned rodent control professionals, like Bobby Corrigan is considered the leading rodent control professional in the United States. He's a rodentologist, a PhD. He works in consultation with many of the big cities in the Northeast. I interviewed him. He told me in no uncertain terms that Escars should be banned, that it's like DDT. There's no place for these poisons. Now, 5 years ago, he didn't believe that. It took him basically being on a break from COVID and having downtime where he went into the literature and looked up all the science, and he was pretty shocked by it. So if it took even, this very educated person to come around till he realized that, I think there's still a lag time on the lower end of the spectrum in this field. Next slide, please. And again, so I interviewed the EPA. I asked them explicitly, like, can pest control people tell you this doesn't harm wildlife, tell you it doesn't harm kids or pets? And she just told me, this is a direct quote, it's not a violation under FIFRA for a pest control person to make inaccurate claims about the impacts of their products. It's also not a violation under FIFRA for a landlord to tell you that they're using a product that they're not. They could say, oh, we're not using Escars if they are. Next slide, please. And, a lot of times people will say, well, the EPA allows it, so it must be relatively safe. I could probably do a whole different PowerPoint about the problems with the EPA. The EPA is very lax in the chemicals they allow, especially in the current administration. But really, it's been a problem since the 80s, since the Reagan administration. These are just some articles you can look up. The Intercept and ProPublica have done a whole series about the EPA and the lax testing. Just to give a quick example, we have 40,000 industrial chemicals that are in commerce in the US. only 200 out of those 40,000 have had any testing whatsoever for safety. So and that's totally allowed under the EPA. So, the EPA, that's why I think the pest control industry really likes to say, like, let's just leave it to the EPA, because they're really vulnerable to lobbying. And if the EPA allows it, they know that their products will still be, enabled. So next slide, please. And even though I'm mostly talking about secondary poisoning, I do want to just say that these bait stations, they are not tamper proof. They're tamper resistant. EPA actually made it illegal to market them as tamper proof because they can be easily broken open by animals or the elements. These are just some pictures either I or other people have taken, like that one in the top left-hand corner that was outside of a Whole Foods from last winter that I took. And I actually saw footprints of what looked like either a raccoon or a possum that had come to and from it. You can see it's been eaten. I don't even know how long it was open or broken open like that, but you can see the debris and the leaves, so probably a while. You can see that picture on the right. That's a juvenile, opossum. That's from Yale University in Connecticut. And this happens a lot with opossums, especially when they're just, juveniles and just weaning from their mothers and they're on their own. They'll crawl into or break open these bait stations and just gorge themselves on this bait. That picture in the bottom left-hand corner is a family of squirrels actually broke open a bait station in my neighborhood, and they distributed it. You can see it's eating the bait. And then several days later, several of them were found dead around people's yards. So and squirrels and chipmunks, we have had several of them that we've tested that we found dead in my town that have these poisons. So they get in that bait stations too. Next slide, please. And there was even a study out of Chicago that looked at mesocarnivores, so again, possums, raccoons, and skunks. And it found out of, I think it was 100 of them, 100% of them were exposed to these anticoagulants. And most of them, they do think probably broke open the bait stations, though some of them might have also had some secondary poisoning because they do eat rodents as well. But what was interesting is this picture of this possum. They actually, when they did a necropsy, they found that it had the bait in its gut, so they know it was a firsthand exposure, but it had babies in its pouch. The babies were all exposed too, which means that it got exposure from their mother's milk. So it was passed along via nursing. So they've found that in mammals that you can pass along this anticoagulant exposure by nursing, and moms can also pass it all along to their fetuses in utero. Next slide, please. I do want to say that something that was really surprising to me when I first did my first big article on this, and again, when I was doing a second one, I could not find a single peer-reviewed study that these anticoagulants reduce rodents at all in any contiguous ecosystem. So by contiguous, I mean other than, islands, small islands where sometimes in small islands, they'll helicopter drop thousands of pounds of this bait raw. And then in those cases, it might kill off the rats on that island. It also kills off a lot of other things. But there's no studies anywhere outside of islands that these poisons work at all in reducing rats or mice. And in fact, what studies are around show that rats and mice are just continuing to rise in their populations despite the fact that eschars are also rising in use. So at the very least, they're not helping. I actually think they might even be contributing to the problem because, again, we're killing off predators that help rein in the problem. So we're kind of inciting a trophic cascade, which is going to ironically make our rodent problem worse when we're killing the predators that can do a much better job than these poisons can. Next slide, please. So, we are noticing more rats, and I do think poison is part of it, but it's also climate change, increased human population and density. So not just that the population is growing, but we're having denser towns and neighborhoods, and there's more trash, and rats like our trash. We're in a construction boom in a lot of parts of the United States, and construction doesn't necessarily increase their populations, but it does disrupt them. And so you will see them more because it disrupts their burrows. And the pandemic also did some shifts, when restaurants and stuff closed, some of them did shift more to residential areas. Next slide, please. But I do want to just take a moment to just tackle a couple of the myths about rats, because I do think when we have a lot of negative perceptions, that's what feeds into widespread poison. Um, I can't tell you how many times people have asked me about rabies in rats, and it's just any mammal in theory can get rabies, but it's virtually non-existent. There's never been a single reported case of rats or mice spreading rabies. Um, in fact, in general, disease transmission to rats and mice is very low. But actually, the studies that exist on this have shown that poisoned rats are more likely to have and spread certain diseases like leptospirosis. They think, similar to the mange in the larger fur-bearing mammals, they think it compromises their immune system. So rats will have these diseases that they're more likely to spread to people if they have these poisons in their system. Um, a person is hundreds of times more likely to be bitten by a dog or a cat than a rat. And a child is much, much more likely to be poisoned by rodenticides than sickened by a rat in most areas. Um, and the truth of the matter is, many rats and mice, just like with the first generation, are now biologically resistant to the eschars, meaning, similar to antibiotic resistance, they can eat it indefinitely for weeks or sometimes months, some studies show, without it being affecting them. Just because they have such high fecundity rates, they reproduce so fast, they can get this resistance, but their predators can't. So there's a mismatch. So their predators can't develop this kind of resistance the way the rats and mice can. Next slide, please. That's just one of the studies about leptospirosis. The other thing I want to say is, I will sometimes come across dead or dying rats, not a lot, but sometimes. And what's interesting is a lot of times I'll come across them in these high traffic areas in the middle of the day. That rat on the right hand, that was only a couple of houses down from a school that was letting out while I was there filming it, and it was spitting up blood, and kids were walking a couple of feet away. That other rat on the left side, that's in a baseball field where two kids were playing. So when the poison does kill them or make them sick, it makes them act in ways that they could spread disease more, because a healthy rat's not going to go around people. But these rats are. And so whatever parasites they have, whatever their diseases, they're more likely to spread when they're doing this. Next slide, please. And so, the question I often get asked is, well, what else do we use? So again, I want to say that there's no studies that show these poisons work. And in fact, they probably are making the issue worse. But really the answer, and I know sometimes people don't like it because it's not the most simplest answer, is we really have to work on better sanitation and exclusion. I see so many overflowing dumpsters like the one on the left, and they just have bait stations around them. I actually noticed in my affordable housing that I mentioned that they got lazier, our landlords, about the dumpsters once they started putting down poison. So we wound up getting a rodent problem we didn't originally have. So, we really do have to do better dumpster management, maybe taking down our feeders. Feeders, I love birds, but bird feeders are sometimes a huge attractant to rats where I live. And even if you don't put down poisons, I know this because I get the calls all the time. Someone will call me and say, I have one neighbor on one side of me that has these bird feeders, and another neighbor who just put down a ton of rat poison to deal with the rats that are being attracted. So I still always kind of veer on the side of just take down your feeders, because it's not worth having other people put down poison, because once they put it down, you can't control what other people are doing in their yards, but you can control what you are contributing in terms of, like, maybe attracting or not attracting rodents. Next slide, please. And also another part of the thing, the solution is to allow our natural predators to flourish. And this has real data behind it. There was a study out of California that found that one site used like nest boxes and perches to, encourage hawks and owls to live there. And the other site used anticoagulants. Guess which one had much superior rodent control? It was the side that had no poisons, but a lot more predators, by more than 50% rodent control. So, and there's a lot of other studies that are being done on this that have also come out on the side of the predators. And, California, the organization is called Raptors Are the Solution, because they are part of the solution. Next slide, please. And I know sometimes there's a lot of fear mongering of, oh, if we go the way of California, they're having Ratmageddon, but the actual data doesn't show that. So they've, I spoke to this wildlife biologist who did all these public records requests in the past year, And she found that actually rat sightings, which are the proxy by which we calculate if rat numbers are up or down, are at a 10-year low right now in California as of last year. And so really the overall of those counties that keep track or keep those numbers. So really the data shows that, like, the moratorium has not led to rat apocalypse. Now, rat numbers can wax and wane for a number of different reasons. Like I said, climate fluctuations, but at the least it's showing that, like, putting these poisons on a moratorium isn't leading to some kind of immediate spike in rats, as sometimes industry likes to fearmonger about. Next slide, please. And so I do want to bring this up because New Hampshire, I know, I've heard the pest control lobby, the New England Pest Control Management Association, has brought this up, where they say, well, consumers are the real problem. They're the ones using poison in ways that are harming the wildlife. We use it in this special way. There's no special way. They put it in bait. They put it in these bait boxes. But like I said, the rodent's the poison source. But I do want to say the actual data that exists shows that pest control companies are by far the largest purchaser and user of all rodenticides, of which anticoagulants dominate. Whereas private households are the smallest share. So they do seem to be, according to various studies, the largest user of these poisons. And for me, at least here in Boston Metro, I see the bait boxes everywhere that didn't exist a decade ago. And those are all put down by the companies. They're not being put down by private consumers. Next slide, please. And that includes, like, even the state house. So I, like a person with Rodenticide Free New Hampshire, I worked with her. I told her a little bit about filing public records requests. So she actually filed public records requests with the state of New Hampshire, and found that they themselves are using SCARs at, like, the majority of their state buildings. So they're all SCARs, and I think one small sliver of a first generation anticoagulant. They're being stationed, as you can see in this graph, monthly. So they're being restocked almost monthly, the bait. So New Hampshire itself as a state is using these SCARs and contracting with these pest companies, including Pest End, which is, I feel like, is a conflict of interest, since Pest End Inc. is also the head is the representative of the New England Pest Management Association, and he's been on, like, the state task force on this. So I feel like there's a bit of a conflict of interest there. Next slide, please. And actually in 2022, the New England Pest Management Association took credit, saying that they fought the rodenticide bill that had been introduced back then in New Hampshire, and that they got it downsized to what they called a more innocuous study bill with one of their representatives on that task force. So they're paying very close attention to New Hampshire. Next slide, please. And the New Hampshire Bulletin talked about, there were two bills. One was like a consumer ban. One was more of a real ban. The real ban in New Hampshire got kind of, like, tanked, and I think it was because of the pest control lobby, but the consumer ban is still being expedited in the state house. I'm not a fan of the consumer ban because, again, consumers are not the primary users or distributors. I mean, sometimes through contracting they might be, but the pest control companies are putting them down. But also, again, it doesn't make a difference who's putting it down, because, again, it's the rodent that's the poison source. And if we're putting these poisons everywhere, the predators will still get them. Next slide, please. So we've been working to kind of spread the message about that. Like, my organization funded this billboard in New Hampshire by Wyndham. That's actually a real photo of the snowy owl Seabrook that died, that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. Several went in several times. Next slide, please. And we have these bus ads right now in Manchester, again, mostly with real animals like Seabrook. And, we have the tagline, no matter who applies it, because we really want to let people know that it really doesn't matter who's applying these poisons, that they are going to kill some animals, as long as those poisons are being distributed by anyone, any source. I chose New Hampshire in part because the representative, I think, of New Hampshire mentioned during the debate that he thought the bald eagles would be safe in New Hampshire because it's an urbanized area and urban eagles aren't really eating the rats. And again, as someone who lives in an urban area where we just lost our third eagle, We just lost our third eagle within the past month, so that's now the third one to these poisons. I know that that's not true. Next slide, please. So I just have a couple more slides. I know we're getting at time. So I would just encourage people to consider starting your own group, whether a Save Wildlife group, because that does have some recognition now, I think, in the area, or some kind of group, even if it's just you or a couple of people. I think that could be enough. Start a website, start something small. Next slide, please. Really, because towns and cities can do a lot on this and other environmental issues. There's already a lot of precedent for municipalities doing things like plastic bag bans and, styrofoam bans. And we can start trying to do that about this issue as well in the ways we can. Next slide, please. So we've done these poison-free pledge campaigns where we ask businesses to have this kind of like poison-free pledge thing on their windows to get the word out. We have these lawn signs, and we've even gotten places like churches to have them about the rat poisons. Again, we fight for these municipal lands bans, which I've found have been very effective, but and home rule petitions. But if you are living in a state where you can't do a home rule petition, consider a non-binding resolution. Municipalities can pass these resolutions saying, we want to ban this. We want the state to ban this. And if more municipalities do that, that does pressure the states. We also asked our Board of Health to stop allowing these poisons to be distributed in demolition sites during construction. And we got here in Arlington, we had them change their policy so that there are no more bait boxes at any of these sites. And our local housing authorities too, which are usually their own entities. We managed to get our housing authority to stop using these poisons as well. Next slide, please. And just to wrap up, there's this interesting Earthwise Aware has this kind of app called, I think it's now called the AR Brigade, where you can take pictures of bait boxes, obviously, as long as it's, viewable from where you are. Don't go on anyone's private property. And you can put it in this system and just sort of as a tracking thing to see where these bait boxes are, see if they're labeled. If they are labeled, is that what they're using? It's just helped to have that data. I know here in Massachusetts, and I think other places can consider doing the same. Next slide. So I'm just wrapping up. This is one of my favorite quotes from Silent Spring. The public must decide whether it wishes to continue on the present road, and it can only do so when in full possession of the facts. I hope I've given you some facts to arm yourself with. Next slide, please. And if you're interested in supporting some of our work, savemasswildlife.org, there's a donate button. That's how we get our donations to do our bus ads and billboards. And we were doing, like I said, necropsies, but we're not doing those right now. And on the Save Arlington Wildlife page, we do have an activist toolkit about ways to get started in your own community, a frequently asked questions page, alternatives to rodenticides. So those might be helpful just getting started.
Wow, Laura,
Thanks.
you so much. I'm just gonna stop sharing the screen. So if anybody wants to just jot down that information before I start, I'm gonna give everybody just a second. Okay.
It got dark while I was presenting.
We'll also make sure we include that information in our follow-up email to everybody. But thank you so much. That was a lot of incredible information. Yes. So much of it devastating. I felt myself really moved so often, and people had a lot of questions, some of which you responded to. But I guess one thing that Joanne was wondering is she had read that if you walk in the grass barefoot, that you can end up with this in your body. Is that something you know anything about?
It just froze out on me for a minute.
Oh, sorry.
So, sorry.
Okay, I'll repeat the question. This is from Joanne, who had heard that if you walk in grass and there's a bait box near the grass and it's washed into the grass, and let's say you're barefoot, that you can absorb it into your body. And then she had also heard even if it's on the bottom of your shoes. So any information about that?
I don't know transdermally how much you can absorb. I mean, obviously, if there's a bait station nearby, I would be careful not to walk barefoot near it. Especially if there's been a rain, like I said, sometimes it can flood out. I don't know if they've actually, I haven't seen any studies on transdermal, like, absorbing it through the skin.
Okay.
But with any toxin, I would be careful um, about that.
Okay. Here's another question. This is from Marilyn. She is wondering if you could talk about if there's any safe alternatives. I know that I've heard about something called Radex or Mousex, which is corn-based. And on a follow-up to that question, she also wondered if you did hire a pest control company, what are the questions you need to ask them to make sure they're not using this on your site?
Yeah, that's a good question, that especially that second half. So I do have a page at Save Arlington Wildlife at my website called Alternatives to Rodenticide. Um, I'm not really a fan of any rat poisons. Save Arlington Wildlife doesn't endorse any rat poisons because, again, all of them are very deadly to pets. All of them are dangerous to children if they get their hands on them. So we don't really want to endorse any rat poison. So obviously, there's sort of a tier of harm, with the anticoagulants being the worst, then bromethalin, then vitamin D. So there's that tier, but they are all bad. Like you said, Radex is a corn gluten. We're not crazy about that because, again, if you're putting down any kind of bait, you're baiting the rodents into the area. There's like controversy or debate about whether it can kill non-target rodents, because one of the ways it works is by not letting them vomit it up, because rodents can't vomit and chipmunks and squirrels can't either. So it's not quite, there's been controversy about whether or not it can harm non-targets. Supplemental trapping can be, old fashioned snap traps. And again, I'd say the old fashioned ones, not the T-Rex ones, because those ones don't really work well. They cause a lot of like maiming of the animals and suffering, but the old fashioned, like kind of wood ones with the spring base. But fertility control, I think ContraPest is now available to consumers online. I know some people have had really good luck with like knocking down their population. Um, Dry ice, if they have burrows, you can use dry ice. But again, the most successful really is going to be the sanitation and exclusion. I really again, taking down your bird feeders, not taking your trash, if at all possible, to outside barrels or dumpsters till basically pickup time. Not leaving pet food out. And so we have a bunch of tips about things you may not even be thinking about that could be attracting the rodents, and exclusion, and there are some companies that specialize in exclusion, sealing up those entryways, but you can even do some decent budget exclusion on I did a kind of DIY exclusion with like a $50 budget in my apartment when they put down those poisons in my building. And I was one of the few people who didn't get a rodent, just using like steel wool and copper and, plugging up my crevices and caulking over it. As for questions to ask, and this is a really good thing, because a really good question, because I've heard so many people who were so sure they weren't using these poisons. You want to know the exact name of the product and the active ingredients. Do not ask them, does this harm wildlife? They're not going to, in most cases, they're not going to tell you honestly, and they might not even know. Again, a lot of them have, those surveys shows a lot of pest control professionals aren't very well versed in the biological effects. So they might even think they're being honest with you, but you want to know what the product is, what the active ingredient is. You can ask for something called the material data safety sheet, which is the actual, and I have this in my frequently asked questions, like what you can ask for. And that will tell you the chemical name, the risks associated with it. And I honestly tell people you might want to be there when they're stocking the bait stations to see what they're putting in. If it's something that is a phosphorescent green or blue, it's probably some kind of bait. There are a couple of non-poisonous baits like that, but 9 out of 10 of them are usually some kind of rat poison. I've had people who thought they had snap traps in their bait stations, and they wound up having, it was escars. I had people who thought, they had ContraPest, and it was escars. So you really want to keep on them. I personally really like trying to support the pest companies that have taken a public stance against these poisons, because I feel like they're the ones I would trust the most to not evade the truth about what they're using.
Great. That was such a great answer. Thank you so much. A lot of our questions, I think, will can be answered through people looking at your website. So we'll make sure we really include that in the follow-up. But I did want to end with a question for you about from Angela, who said that she's sometimes been finding some dead animals in her neighborhood and wondered if they were results of rodenticide, and wondered about if you wanted to get a necropsy done, how do you go about doing that? So if you find something in your neighborhood, how do you find out?
Yeah, it depends on where you are. So, like I said, our organization was working with a veterinarian, but at the state of Massachusetts actually asked us to stop because we were doing so much testing. They said it rose to the level of research and that we needed special permits at this point to continue. Um, so we had to stop. I know wildlife rehabbers, sometimes their license allows them to do some testing, but sometimes wildlife rehabbers are also inundated with the patients they're trying to treat. So I know some of them will test the animals that actually die in their care and route to their care. But you can, if it is a wild animal, you could try asking some veterinarians or wildlife rehabbers. You can try asking your state. We've been pressuring the state to test. What's frustrating is Massachusetts won't really test, but then like they stopped us from continuing our testing. So you really have to check what state you're in. Call like maybe the pesticide board or your state wildlife agency. Ask them if it's on the state endangered species list. They probably will, because often they will test a federally or state endangered species. But if it's not, um, then you have to see what places will, and the state could help you, or you can start asking some vets or wildlife rehab clinics if they're interested. Um, and if it's an animal like a pet, or a rat or a mouse, I think it's a little different because they don't go under the same categories of wildlife. So there's not the same laws that apply to them. So then that might be a little more easier to get testing for with just a veterinarian if you're willing to pay.
Thank you so much. We are over time,
Yeah,
but
I
it's
know. I'm
it's
sorry.
so no, it was so fascinating. We're just going to give you a big round of applause. That was so informative and great. And when you
I just,
finish your book,
yep.
we come back. We
Yeah,
want
can
you
I give a
back.
quick plug? Yeah, so my book
Yes,
is coming out probably in January. Right now, we're between titles, but I think it's going to be called Animal Collateral or Collateral Animals. And it will have rat poison somewhere in the subheader. And I think it's coming out from Princeton University Press. And I do want to say, if you didn't get to ask, if you have any questions about starting some kind of local movement where you are, you can reach me. The best way is probably DMing me through the Facebook page for Save Arlington Wildlife. If you DM me, I'm glad to talk to folks about what we've done here and what we're doing.
that's great. Thank you, Laura, so much. And the Harris Center will definitely be in touch with you to have you maybe come and do a book talk,
Yeah, that would be great.
partnered with our independent bookstore. So again, thank you for taking the lead on this and showing us a good way to go forward. And I hope all of us do something soon
Okay.
about this. So thank you.
Yeah,
And
thank you.
good night to everybody.
Thanks to everyone who came.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.